Welcome to Biology Minds. Today we're going to talk about the spinal cord and spinal nerves as well as the spinal reflexes. So as we move away from talking about the neural tissue and we move more into the larger macro anatomy of the nervous system, we're going to talk about the brain eventually, but right now we're talking about the spinal cord. So spinal reflexes are kind of, we think of as being separate from messages that are going to be sent to the brain. So they're rapid, they're automatic responses triggered by specific stimuli. So we always think about stimuli is going to send a message up to the brain. The brain is going to comprehend this and send a message back on how to react, but it's not always like that. When we talk about reflexes opposed to reactions, when we talk about reactions, we're talking about the brain, but when we talk about reflexes, we're talking about the spinal cord really taking in this information and responding on its own to it. So it's controlled by the spinal cord alone and not the brain. Here we see that we're on chapter 13 right now. Chapter 12 was just talking about neural tissue, talking about the neurons, the neuroglia. Now we move into the larger structures. We move into the spinal cord. And then next chapter we'll get into the brain. So the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, it's about 18 inches long. You know, obviously every person is different. Their spinal cord is going to be a different length, but just as a general idea, it's about 18 inches long and half an inch wide. Ends between the L1 and the L2 vertebrae. And it has a certain shape to it. We think of it as being kind of like an oval shape, but it does have these kind of grooves. You have a posterior median sulcus on the back side, and you have an anterior median fissure, which is deeper on the front side or the anterior side. Enlargements of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is not just one width throughout. We have enlargements to it. There's going to be a cervical or a neck enlargement, which holds the nerves of the shoulders and the upper limbs. And then you're going to have the lumbar enlargement, okay, further down past the thoracic area. And that's going to connect to the nerves of the pelvis and the lower limbs. The distal end is going to have this conus medullaris, which is a thin conical spinal cord below the lumbar enlargement, and then you have the filum terminale, which is where it really ends, and it attaches to the coccygeal ligament. And then you have a cauda equina, which the nerve roots extending below the conus medullaris. This shows you just a general picture of the spinal cord. So you see as you move down the spinal cord from the cervical region to the thoracic region, this looks a little bit different. The gray matter changes, the white matter is different, and we see different enlargements as the cervical area is a different width than the thoracic region, and the lumbar area is also different as well. And as you move past that to the lumbar and the sacral area, you are going to pass this cauda equina and eventually get to the filum terminale, where it all ends. This just shows you the cervical. All right, this is they like to show this as a general idea of the spinal cord. You have your gray matter, which is shown in this kind of beige color, taupe color, and then you have your white matter here. Coming from there, you are going to have your dorsal root towards the posterior. So when we're looking at this, this is towards the front of the person, this is towards the back of the person. So anterior, you're going to have your ventral root. Posterior, you're going to have your dorsal root. Part of the dorsal root is this bundle right here that we call the dorsal root ganglion. And these are going to come together to create these spinal nerves. And the spinal nerves can contain the neurons within them. All right, neurons, we talked about them being very long. They have those long axons. Those are within the spinal nerves. It's bundles of neurons in a spinal nerve. So thoracic nerves, thoracic region of the spinal cord, you're going to have different gray matter and white matter, and it's not going to have that enlargement like we see in the lumbar and the cervical region of the spinal cord. Lumbar region, see, and then the sacral region of the spinal cord as well. So 31 spinal cord segments. Okay, obviously, in anatomy we love to break things up into segments. It's one piece, but if we wanted to really break it up into the different segments, we could talk about there being 31 segments based on the vertebrae where the spinal nerves originate. And you have cervical nerves, which are named for the vertebrae below it. Okay, and all the other nerves are named for the vertebrae above it. Okay, so cervical nerves, the one that sits above the C1 is going to be called the C1. Okay, and the other ones, if we talk about the T2, okay, what's below the T2 is going to be the T2 nerve. Okay, so it's really it changes after the cervical vertebrae, which are named based on the inferior vertebrae. What is below it? The rest are named based on the vertebrae above it. You have two branches of the spinal nerves: the ventral root, dorsal root. Like I said, the dorsal root has this bundle that is attached to it, which we call the dorsal root ganglion or ganglia. Ventral root contains the axons of the motor neurons, so that front portion, that anterior portion of the spinal cord with those ventral roots coming off it are going to contain motor neurons, and the dorsal or the posterior root that we see is going to contain axons of the sensory neurons. And within the dorsal root ganglia, that bulging area of the dorsal root, that contains cell bodies of the sensory neurons. So the spinal nerve, each side of the spine, we have spinal nerves coming off of them. The dorsal and the ventral roots are going to join to create this spinal nerve. So we have the dorsal root along with its dorsal root ganglia, and we have its ventral root, and they come off of different sections of that spinal cord. They are going to join together or meet up, and they are going to form one kind of projection off of it, or one tube, if you want to call it, and that's going to be a spinal nerve. They're considered mixed nerves because they carry both afferent or sensory and efferent or motor fibers. So remember, like we talked about in the last set of notes, we talked about SA and ME. So sensory afferent, motor efferent. And there's actually meninges or coverings associated with the spinal cord. You have the innermost, which is the pia mater. You have the in between, the arachnoid mater, and then you have the outer layer, which is the dura mater. This is showing you how this spinal cord sits coming up through the vertebrae. So this is your posterior projection to your vertebrae, and this is why the vertebrae are the way that they are. It's to protect this spinal cord. Like I said, meninges, when we talk about there being meningitis, that is a viral or bacterial infection of the meninges. So you'll get vaccines so that you don't get meningitis because you don't want that swelling of the spinal cord, which can lead to numerous issues. Like I said, the innermost meninge is going to be the pia mater. Then you have in between is the arachnoid mater, and then the outer is the dura mater. Dura mater is tough and fibrous. There's epidural space. So when you talk about someone having an epidural, someone that's pregnant that doesn't want to have too much pain while they're giving birth, they're going to get anesthetized, or they're going to get an injection in order to decrease the pain while they're giving birth. So that's when you hear about a woman getting an epidural, right? They're getting an injection in this epidural space. Arachnoid mater is the in between, and then you have the subdural space between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, and then the subarachnoid space, which is going to be between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So there are spaces in between. Obviously, it's one solid piece, but we like to dissect and separate these things and have anatomical terms for all these spaces. And in this subarachnoid space, we are going to have cerebral spinal fluid, which is very important that we talk more about in chapter 14. It carries dissolved gases, nutrients, and wastes. And a lumbar puncture, often called a spinal tap, is going to remove cerebral spinal fluid in order to test it to check the health of the cerebral spinal fluid and hopefully lead to answers if someone is having neurological issues. Pia mater is the innermost. It's a mesh of collagen and elastic fiber. So once again, we see this collagen and these elastic fibers creating more connective tissue within the body. This is what you would see, if you were to dissect a human cadaver. It's not as easy as the drawn pictures look. All right, because everything is color coded, but this is how it would really look. And within that spinal cord, we have our white matter, which contains axons. Okay, both myelinated and unmyelinated. So remember, we talked about those Schwann cells and the myelinated axons, and we need those axons to be myelinated in order for them to work properly. Well, in this white matter, we have those axons, and in the gray matter, which surrounds that central canal that goes right up the spinal cord, it contains the cell bodies and the neuroglia, as well as unmyelinated axons. So in the gray matter, we have the cell bodies and the neuroglia, and in the white matter, you have those myelinated axons. The projections of the gray matter, where we see that it looks kind of like a butterfly, those projections are called horns. So they have gray horns. And the posterior gray horns, the back ones are called posterior gray horns, the front ones are called anterior gray horns, and then the ones going outwards are the lateral gray horns, easy enough to remember. And then you have the gray commissures, where axons that cross from one side of the cord to the other before reaching the gray matter. You have sensory nuclei in the dorsal or posterior portion of the spinal cord, and then you have the motor nuclei in the ventral roots, or the ventral portion of the anterior portion of the spinal cord. Receptors are going to be part of the sensory one, and then effectors are going to be part of the motor, or the ventral anterior portion of the spinal cord. Posterior white columns lie between the posterior gray horns and posterior median sulcus, and anterior ones lie between the anterior gray horns and the anterior median fissure, and then the lateral white columns are located on each side of the spinal cord between the anterior and posterior columns, just like you saw in that diagram. You have tracts or fasciculi. In white columns, bundles of axons. You have ascending tracts and then descending tracts. The ascending tracts are carrying information to the brain, and then the descending tracts are sending that information on how to respond back to the spinal cord, carrying those motor commands. So you're getting sensory information to the brain through the ascending tracts, and then you're getting motor commands back to the muscles or back to the body through the spinal cord with the descending tracts. Here, this is another diagram showing you what we've been discussing. Here we talk about the different horns, where we have somatic region of the gray matter. You have the visceral region of the gray matter for the motor nuclei within here, and then you have the visceral region and the somatic region of the sensory nuclei right here. Spinal cord summary, just some things you want to remember, that it is all around this central canal, running up through it, surrounded by gray matter containing sensory and motor nuclei. Remember, they're coming off. You have those dorsal root and those ventral roots that have sensory and motor nuclei, which come together to form those mixed nerves, okay, or as we call them, spinal nerves, which are mixed nerves. And the gray matter is covered by a thick layer of white matter, and the white layer consists of ascending and descending axons. So you can't really see it in the diagrams the way they draw it, but it's actually these bundles of axons. And each spinal cord segment is connected to a pair of spinal nerves. like we said. And each spinal nerve is surrounded by 3 connective tissue layers, support structures, and contain blood vessels. 3 connective tissue layers of the spinal nerves. You have the epineurium, which is the outer layer, the perineurium, which is the middle layer, and then you have the endoneurium, which is the inner layer. This shows you a diagram how it is broken up, similar to how we talked about muscles and how they are broken up with the epimysium, paramysium, endomysium. Well, here we talk about the epineurium, the perineurium, and the endoneurium. Peripheral nerves interconnecting branches of the spinal nerve surrounded by connective tissue sheaths. So these are functional parts, and they are going to be protected by these connective tissue coverings or sheaths. Spinal nerves form lateral to the intervertebral foramen, where this is where dorsal and ventral roots unite, and then branch and form pathways to different destinations throughout the body, not just in that vertebral column that we're talking about. And the motor nerves, the first branch, you have the white ramus, and then you have the gray ramus. Motor nerves have the dorsal and the ventral rami. Dorsal ramus contains somatic and visceral motor fibers, and the ventral ramus is going to innervate ventrolateral structures and limbs. So here you see that we have this ventral root of each spinal nerve contains the axons of somatic motor and visceral motor neurons. Okay, and then the spinal nerve forms just lateral to the intervertebral foramen where the dorsal and ventral roots unite. Dorsal rami or ramus is going to contain somatic motor and visceral motor fibers that innervate the skin and skeletal muscles of the back. The axons in the relatively large ventral ramus supply the ventrolateral body surface and structures in the body wall and the limbs. The white ramus is going to communicate. Communicans is the first branch from the spinal nerve and carries visceral motor fibers to a nearby sympathetic ganglion. And then you're going to have the gray ramus communicans, which contains preganglionic fibers that innervate glands and smooth muscles in the body wall or limbs. You have a sympathetic nerve, which contains a preganglionic and postganglionic fibers innervating structures in the thoracic cavity. And this is really where we move on to talk about reflexes. So within your body, you're going to have dermatomes, which are regions of the skin which monitor specific pairs of spinal nerves. Here we see that if I were to touch a certain area of your body, that could be a way of testing the spinal nerves and seeing if they work. So this is your anterior view. Okay, you have your up towards the top, you're going to have your cervical nerves that are going to be used to collect information from stimuli, and as we move down, you have your thoracic, and then your lumbar, and then your sacral. But notice how we have these lines where we have different dermatomes, so it's not as simple as just having it go straight across like the way that the vertebrae are, because as you get down, you see that it starts to bend a lot more, where the L5 runs from the lateral portion of the knee down to the medial portion of the foot. So peripheral neuropathy, when we talk about neuropathy, it's the loss of sensation, can be due to trauma or compression. We see diabetic neuropathy in people that have had diabetes for a long time, that they haven't taken care of themselves or really used the insulin the way that they should and dieted the way that they should. So they lose sensation. That's why we see that people come into the ER and they have these terrible infections because they stepped on something, they didn't know they stepped on something, and got infected, and then you see that people with diabetes, long-standing diabetes, end up having to get their foot amputated or whatever it may be. That's because of the loss of sensation. But it's not just from diabetes; it can be from trauma or compression. Nerve plexuses, that's interwoven networks of these nerve fibers. You have major plexuses of the ventral rami. You have the cervical, brachial, meaning arm, lumbar, and then sacral areas. Here he shows you how from these nerves they create these plexuses. So you have major nerves that are going to come off. You have this phrenic nerve right here is going to go to the diaphragm, and you have this axillary nerve which goes to the arm, musculocutaneous nerve. Thoracic nerves are going to be all throughout this thoracic region, and then we see that we have a radial nerve, an ulnar nerve, a median nerve. These are major nerves that are going to collect information and send information back depending on where the stimuli is going. And then you have other ones that you might have heard of. Femoral nerve is a major one. Okay, that's going to go down to the leg. And you have this giant one right here that we often hear about, the sciatic nerve. So if you have a pinched nerve somewhere in here, all right, say we pinch this nerve and it's not able to send or receive messages, well, then you're going to have issues down here. So when we talk about sciatic nerve, sometimes people have maybe a pinched nerve in their hip, and then they have issues running down all the way through their leg because their sciatic nerve is pinched and it's going down through their leg. Here we see that there are ones going up to the head, which are called cranial nerves. We talk more about this in the next chapter, and is going to be responsible for receiving stimuli and information from the cranium or from the head. Brachial plexus is a major one, contains other major nerves, musculocutaneous nerve, median nerve, ulnar nerve, axillary nerve, and the radial nerve as well. Automatic responses coordinated within the spinal cord. That's what reflexes are. So the information doesn't even go up to the brain. That spinal cord is able to get that information and send back what we want to do or how we want to respond to it. We call it a reflex arc. Step one of the reflex arc we'll talk about is arrival of a stimulus that is going to activate a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is going to send that information to the spinal cord, and the information is processed by the CNS or the central nervous system by that spinal cord, and then it's going to activate the motor neurons, telling the motor neurons how to respond. And then in this example, we're going to remove our hand from that stimulus that is hurting our hand. Sometimes we're going to test these reflexes. So you go to the doctor, they're going to test them. You have involuntary control of the nervous system in somatic reflexes, and then visceral reflexes are going to be controlled systems other than the muscular system. So if we test them, we are testing the somatic reflexes typically. We're going to test the patellar tendon for that knee jerk effect. A stretch reflex is going to see if that muscle is able to collect that stimulus and send back that reactor or that reflex the way that it should. So you go to the doctor, they hit this patellar tendon. Okay, it is going to stretch this muscle. It is telling your spinal cord that you are falling. So it's actually tricking you by them hitting this. It's tricking you, your spinal cord, into thinking that your knee has now bent and you are falling, and it is going to tell your muscle to tighten up, and the response is that your leg is going to kick out. If your leg did give way, then it would be good. It would help you maintain your balance, but this is just tricking you, so you end up kicking your foot out towards the doctor. But this is a reflex arc where you're getting information from the receptor that's sending it back to the sensory neurons. Then the motor neurons are telling the effector how to respond to that stimulus. You have a withdrawal reflex as well that they like to test, which is different depending on your what exactly is happening. So painful stimulus is going to happen. You're going to touch a hot pan. It's going to send that information back, and then it is going to tell the muscle to react to pull your hand away from that hot stove or that hot pan. You have a Babinski reflex, which we talk about it being normal in infants, and it is abnormal in adults. So when we run something along the bottom of your foot, typically your toes are going to go down, and in infants we see that the toes actually go up and they spread out. So that's normal in an infant if they were to go up and spread out, but it's abnormal in an adult. So we see that your toes are going to curl. That's perfectly normal. Means that any neurological issues related to that are negative. But then in a baby, we're going to see that when we do that same exact thing up until about a year old, they're going to fan out their toes, and that's a positive Babinski reflex, which is perfectly normal for an infant. So as we move forward, keep in mind that we are still talking about the neurons and the neuroglia, but now we're seeing the effect that all these different neurons and neuroglia coming together to work together to form these much bigger anatomical structures are going to help us to really maintain homeostasis and build the spinal cord and the brain and the peripheral nerves that we talk about. So keep these things in mind as we move forward.